Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar today. The topic is how to manage across cultures, cultural intelligence as the key to success, and we have the great pleasure of receiving Elizabeth Tuleja, who is joining today from China. We hope we will not have any interference with the sound. If this is the case, just bear with us and we'll try to solve the problem as quickly as possible. This is our 6th Cubin webinar. A few words about the Cubin project. It's designed to help European SMEs with business and innovation in emerging markets. It was set up by a consortium of experts in cultural differences. SMEs are involved, innovations agencies as well, and it is fully financed by the European Commissions. As part of the Cubin project, we also have learning circles. You can check more information on that in the Cubin platform, cubin.eu. A few information about the webinar. All the microphones are muted. This is to ensure the best quality during the webinar. If you have questions, please direct them to me directly at Hofstede Insights or to my colleague Roberto in the chat. We'll help you as quickly as possible. You are free to ask questions at the end of the session, and if you have questions that are unanswered, there is a forum in the Cubin platform that you can use to ask further questions to Elizabeth. I will now leave the microphone to you, Elizabeth. Just give me a couple of seconds to give you the role of speaker.
Sound. Can people hear me? Okay. Hello, everybody. I can say good evening. I am in southwestern China in Chengdu, and I live here, and I'm very excited to be speaking with you all tonight. And I say with you because my goal is not to speak to you, but to share some ideas with you. And I am going to run through some slides that talk about how do we become more culturally intelligent as managers, as leaders, and how that can affect us and affect other people in the workplace. And I'm basing this brief webinar based upon a chapter of I've written of a new book that's coming out called Exceptional Leadership by Design, and it's a book written for the International Leadership Association by a group of maybe 15 of us from around the world, and we've all shared our different areas of expertise, and mine being with cross-cultural management. I've written a chapter on cultural intelligence that rather than being academic, it's very applicable, and I'm going to talk tonight or today or this morning about 3 key antecedents to becoming culturally intelligent. And at the end, we will have time for questions. So let's get started. I want to give you an introduction and make this kind of hands-on, and I'm going to tell you a story. 2 business people meet for an initial discussion concerning whether their companies might have some advantageous synergies for future business together. Ms. Dorothee Werner, German-born, having grown up in the USA for most of her life, is talking with Mr. Jintao Zhang from China. They exchange business cards, and Ms. Werner thrusts out her hand and introduces herself. I'm Dorothee Werner. Please call me Dottie. Mr. Zhang reciprocates with his business card and replies, I'm Charles Zhang, and I'm pleased to meet you, Ms. Werner. Ms. Werner immediately responds, oh, please call me Dottie. All my friends and colleagues do. I have a feeling that soon we will be colleagues as well. Mr. Zhang replies with a polite response, yes, Of course. And Ms. Werner looks over his business card, and knowing that Chinese people put their surnames first, she respectfully, in her mind, says, Zhang, Jintao. She pauses as she turns the card over thoughtfully to examine its contents. Jintao, I am glad to have made this connection, and I will give you a call first thing tomorrow morning so that we can talk about the products I mentioned. We should move along quickly on this. Time is money, right? Mr. Zhang smiles and says, Of course, Mrs. Werner. Thank you for your time and your interest. Both part with quite different perceptions of this meeting. I want you to think for a few moments, what happened here? Two different people from two different cultures with two very different worldviews. So, Ms. Werner, she's pleased that she met Mr. Zhang. He's warm, he smiled. That was evidence to her that the encounter went well. In her culture, if somebody smiles at you, that's good. And when he agreed to have a formal meeting to discuss their pricing, that was really good. And she was also pleased with herself because she showed sensitivity, calling him by his Chinese name rather than the Western name that he gave her. And she didn't want to impose her culture on him. And he probably felt that it was necessary with Westerners to use his Western name. So she was trying to be sensitive and use his Chinese name. But Mr. Zhang's reaction was very different. He, in his mind, felt uncomfortable and began to think that it would be difficult to work with Ms. Werner because of her lack of cultural sensitivity. He didn't see her sensitivity the way that she did. So he was feeling that it was quite awkward that she would use his Chinese name, his given name, Jintao, rather than Charles or Mr. Zhang. And he smiled, not because he was happy, but because he was embarrassed. And how could he even discuss a business plan before he got to know her and also her company? What did they stand for? He would need to spend a lot of time vetting her and doing his due diligence. So he was very cautious about any future interactions with Ms. Werner. I want you to think about what the underlying attitudes, values, beliefs, perceptions were in this exchange. And at the end, I'm sorry, I paused because I'm getting some more comments that you cannot hear me. I'm so sorry. I will turn my mic up again to 100% sound. So hopefully you can hear me now. Can I get a response from Celia or Rob? I'll just hold it here. So I want you to think about, as I talk through the next slides, what you think was happening here. I've given you some ideas, and we can deconstruct this later at the end of the session, and we can have a discussion about it. If you're interested in learning more about the 6 basic dilemmas or cultural dimensions that Professor Gerhard Hofstede created over 50 years ago, you can go to the Hofstede Insights website, And you can click on the tab for, tell you this tab, for our models, and then click on the next tab for country comparison. And that way you'll be able to follow along if you'd like with me. I'm going to talk about China uh, specifically, but these dimensions can be also looked at generally. So let me go through each of these briefly. Many of you already know what these different basic dilemmas, these cultural dilemmas are, and to some of you this might be new. So I'll briefly go through China and talk about what some of the specific meanings of culture are for Chinese. And one of the things that we always say when we're talking about cultural dilemmas or cultural dimensions is that this research that Professor Hofstede did 50 years ago and has continued to revalidate the data, we look at the central tendencies, that bell curve, and we study nations, groups of people, not the individuals. And so when you get many different people answering surveys that have been validated and are reliable across cultures, you get composite information. And so you have this bell-shaped curve of the central tendency. And so we can say with confidence that generally people from different cultures have different ways of communicating. And yet we have to remember that all of us are individuals, and this data, this survey data, measures the central tendencies of a group of people. And we know that on either side of the bell curve, we're going to have people who differ. So here are China's dimensions, and again, you can go to Hofstede Insight's website, go to our models, and then click on country comparisons. And let me tell you some of these interesting aspects of these cultural dilemmas based upon China's score. So China is very high on power distance. And power distance means that there is this understanding that there's going to be a difference in how power is distributed. And people may not agree with that, but they know that it's normal, and that's what they have to live with in their culture. Living here in China, I know that there is a high power distance, unlike what we have in the U.S., although in the U.S. we do have a fair amount of power distance here. But in China, 80 out of 100 is very high. And every time I go to the bank and they tell me, we need your passport, or your name isn't spelled exactly as it is on the passport, go back to your office and get a job certification level, I know I'm in a high power distance culture. I also know that when my internet goes out and I'm having trouble even with 2 separate VPNs, I know I'm in a high power distance culture. When we look at individualism versus collectivism, China has a very low score for individualism, and they have 20 on the scale, on the Hofstede scale. And this basically means that life evolves around the group, extended family, close friends. You're going to do what pleases the group. You may not want to do it. You may want to be making your own choices and doing what you want to do. But the thousands of years of Chinese tradition means that you are going to be very careful not to disturb the social harmony and the status of where you are in that society. The father, the mother, the children, or the grandparents, the children, everybody has a place in society. So you know that your first priority is to your group. Let me give a quick takeaway because it's very interesting when we can look at these dimensions combined. When we have high power distance and that low score for individualism, or we could say it on the inverse, high collectivism, one thing that we need to remember is that personal and business relationships tend to blend and there aren't clear boundaries. It is so important to realize that if you're going to do business in China, you need to understand that developing close relationships, spending time so people can get to know you and trust you, that is paramount. You have got to spend that time. This past weekend, I had a conference, and I was meeting with a group of other business people in a 2-day conference. The first day was all relationship building, and I have a very busy schedule. And when I thought about attending this conference, and I was asked to speak on global leadership from an ecological perspective, and my perspective was a socially ecological perspective. Rather than environmental. We had environmentalists, and then I came and talked as a social environmentalist. And I thought, oh my goodness, all of this time spending the day, spending the evening beforehand, but it was necessary. I knew I had to go so that people could get to know me, begin to trust me, and then I'm probably going to have more opportunities for collaboration. And then the very next day, on Saturday, it was a big, big formal celebration of signing some important documents, taking pictures, having a tour of the site, more pictures, having an afternoon tea, more pictures, and then finally 4 hours of discussions and people giving presentations. And it didn't end there. Afterwards, there was an evening banquet with lots of toasting and drinking. And it was very important for me to remember I am in a being culture that is collaborative and has this high power distance. And so I had to be patient and not think about doing. Okay, let's get to the next thing. I really wanted to see the schedule and be able to plan my day. Okay, we do this, we do that, we do the other thing. But that's not the way that it works most of the time in China. So I'm always looking for these key takeaways and trying to remind myself to be patient. When we look at the next dimension for how we achieve success or how we collaborate to have good relationships, that's called masculinity versus femininity. And this is not about the biological aspects of masculinity and femininity, but about the social aspects. And so China has a high score, 66, on masculinity, which means achievement, success, and femininity, which means the collaboration, the nurturing. And when you think about how people in China live and do business, it's a very competitive society. I work with students here at the university, and students are constantly telling me how they are pleasant to each other, but they're competing against each other to take the Gaokao, the high test, where they have to achieve such high standards, otherwise they won't be able to go to college. And being able to get a good score means you get into a good university, which means you bring honor to your family, you get a good job, and it brings that prestige, that honor, not just to you, but to your parents and your grandparents and your ancestors. Very, very important. Young people from middle school through secondary school will study 10, 12, 14 hours a day to take this dreaded Gaokao exam. Migrant workers will leave their families and move thousands of kilometers away to work without being with their children. And grandparents will take care of the children because the parents want to be able to put away money so that they can hopefully send their child to school. um, service people will work long hours. Everything is open till 10, 11 p.m., and people work long hours. I remember a while back I was late for a hair appointment, and I felt terrible. And I said to them, look, I'm late. I came just to let you know that I didn't cancel my appointment. You probably don't have time. I will go home. They're like, no, 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 no. And they stayed very late just to serve me. This would not happen in the U.S. If you're late or you miss your appointment, that's it. People work here really hard, and they save their money, and they want to have success. I was talking at this conference with a young man who told me that his parents are more concerned when he talks about the money he makes from his small business than when he talks about the fact that he was at this conference learning more about green leadership. How can we be ecologically, environmentally good leaders, as well as emotionally and socially good leaders? And he said, they're good people, and I don't want that to sound bad, but that is the Chinese way to achieve status, to achieve money, to achieve education. It's a very, very specific worldview. We have this other dimension called uncertainty avoidance. And China is low on uncertainty avoidance. And people generally, again, the bell curve, have this comfortable relationship with the fact that the future can't be known. And so while there are lots of rules in China, lots of hierarchy, everybody knows their place. And this goes back to the 4th, 5th century BC with Confucius, who talked about we know our place in society based upon the hierarchy of the emperor, the father, the mother, the older brother, the younger brother, the older sister, the younger sister, down, 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 down. You've got this hierarchy, but having that hierarchy helps people deal with the fact that life is uncertain. If everybody knows their place in life, then there will be harmony. They will work together. All of these different dimensions are working together. The power distance, the individualism or collectivism, the drivenness for success, the aspect of uncertainty. What's fascinating here, and I'll be blogging on this. This is the last blog I'll do about the Hofstede dimensions in particular. I've been blogging these 7 months while I've been here in China as a Fulbright scholar, and I've been going through the different dimensions, looking at them on China's terms. And the last one I'll be talking about is uncertainty avoidance. And I like to think of a great example of how people drive. Today I put my helmet on, I got on a bike, and I had to ride to a meeting that was pretty far away, and I wanted to just kind of see how I can do. The buses have priority, then the trucks, then the cars, then the electric scooters, then the bikes, then the people. The pedestrian, the person comes last. And the traffic, it just merges it in and out, and the bikes go this way, and the motor scooters go that way, and it's a mess. But people take it in stride. They are comfortable with uncertainty. They are flexible. A car might be driving down the wrong side of the street. Well, you just get out of its way. It'll find its way eventually, and you just have to be careful because the car is bigger than you. I think that's a great example. And also the language. The language is very ambiguous. Tonight, just before this lecture, I had my tutor, and I had a class. And so we were talking, and I asked her, I have this little, I don't know if you can see this, it's a snail. And I remember asking her what the term is. And actually, I forget what she said. I wrote it down, and I said, why is it called that? And she said, well, it really has no meaning. It's just you have to go back to history and try to remember how to say snail. I remember now. U niu, and niu means cow, and niu. This isn't a cow; it's a snail. Okay, and it just for some reason it has no meaning, so it's very ambiguous. Two more dimensions. China has a very high score for long-term orientation, 87 out of 100, and it has a low score for indulgence. It's 24. So in China, because of that high power distance and because of the fact for the collectivism, you need to be able to um, think about the collective whole and how how the society works together and the high power distance. You are going to want to get to know somebody and invest in the long term. I plan to be in China for a long time, and I'm making my business contacts and my educational contacts. And so I need to remember that for this 10 minutes that I had to speak at this conference, that lasted the 4 hours of different speakers. I had to spend 2 days investing time so that people could get to know me. That's the long-term view. And in relation to indulgence, do we work before we play, or do we play before we work? Very important to sacrifice personal comforts to achieve your goals. And you will see people do that, the migrant workers going far away to save money, to send back to their family, to educate their children, to help their parents, to pay for medical bills, or kids studying for a long time to be able to go to school. So all of these 6 dimensions, as I've just explained them, and I went a little long-winded, but I love to share examples. But these 6 dimensions can help us as we try to analyze the differences and similarities of people with whom we work or we hope to work in business and education and in our communities. So I want to get to the heart of my conversation with you tonight, or hoping to have a dialogue. And the next 15 minutes, I would like to share some of the insights that I have gained through my research, through my teaching, through my consulting. And I would like to be able to just talk and put this into perspective and share some ideas about cultural intelligence, or CQ. And the Economist Intelligence Unit does some really great reports every few years, and we are coming up on 2020. It's fascinating. They interviewed over 500 global CEOs from many different countries, and they were looking at startling statistics. When these CEOs were asked about working and dealing with clients all over the world, 70% said that they believe their company's operational presence would increase overseas. 78% said that their teams would collaborate more across borders. 50% said that the greatest threat to smooth operations across border were about differences regarding cultural norms. And 50% said communication misunderstandings specifically were going to impede any sort of international dealings. And when asked about training, and I like to call training guided learning, because we can use an executive coach or a teacher or a consultant to help guide us as we learn more about ourselves and about others. 90% said that if they could provide this guided learning, that they could improve their profit, revenue, market share. And they thought that if they had this knowledge, that they could handle intercultural differences better. So there is a need, and we know that there is a need. Whether we have lived abroad, whether we live in proximity to other nations and people of various cultures and languages, whether we are polyglots and can speak 5 languages. That doesn't necessarily mean that we are going to be culturally intelligent. And I want to share with you very briefly some of the research that's been done. I will share some sources with you. And it's research done by colleagues, but it's also research done by myself. And the 3 things that I have been focusing on recently are openness, curiosity, and knowledge building. And I want to share with you this very interesting research study done by a pair of Cornell University professors in psychology in the U.S. And they have determined that people generally tend to think that they're better at things than they usually are, and they call this unconscious incompetence. And as a result, we find that it's not about self-confidence. It's about thinking that we're better at doing something than we really are. And this can impede our success, impede our learning. And when I work with executives around the world, I find that an antecedent to being able to work cross-culturally is having that openness, that willingness to say, I don't know everything. There are things that I can learn. Whether I have a lot of education, I have a lot of international experience, whether I'm a CEO, I need to learn. Every day is a learning opportunity. And I have this image here about CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation. I was walking through a Dallas airport a couple of years ago. I went to film an online course. I do a lot of online education. And if you'd like to learn more about me, you can go on to the Hush Data Insights website and look at my profile. You can also go to LinkedIn. And on LinkedIn, you can read a lot about me and read my blog there. I do a lot of blogging. And there was this interesting CPR doll. And it gave some instructions. And I walked over to it. I read the instruction. And it's kind of clever. It had the Saturday Night Fever, da, 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 staying alive. So it was really cute how they were trying to get people to use the rhythm of that U.S. American song, and you had to apply pressure and count and see if you could do it. And I was shocked at how weak I was and how hard that I had to press in order to get the make-believe blood flowing to the dummy. So that talked to me, or that spoke to me about incompetence. And there's a wonderful model that I like to use that helps us identify our cultural ability or inability. And we all go through this process of being in denial. Oh, there are no differences. Let's just all try to understand each other. When we hit culture shock, we can polarize and get into that us versus them. Oh, why don't Chinese do things the way that I do things? I'm so frustrated when I go to the bank, or I'm so frustrated with the internet. Another stage is we can minimize. And in the U.S., we deal with a lot of political correct interactions, and we can think, oh, no, we shouldn't look at differences. Let's all try to be the same. We don't want to upset people. However, I firmly believe if we can look at differences, and that's not pointing at people and saying, you're this or you're that, but being able to say we have different beliefs, values, attitudes, we can become better intercultural communicators. And only when we can realize that we tend to minimize people, that is when we can move into acceptance and move into adaptation. I'm going to move on just because I'm looking at the time, and I do want to have time for questions at the end. I have a bunch of these bottles here, and I want to tell a story. I have a student of mine, one of my online degree students, told me this wonderful story where he was open and wanted to develop self-awareness and also curiosity. We're moving into the second point of cultural intelligence development here. And he was very upset at when he was in Ethiopia doing some consulting. People were throwing plastic bottles on the ground. And he was very angry about this and started to judge people, saying, "Why are you littering?" But he told me he started to ask his colleagues for more information about why. And he was open and he wanted to be curious. He withheld his judgment. And people told him that the reason why people threw bottles on the ground was that somebody else would have to pick them up, and that gave them a job. And so it was kind of this collective process of, we are going to give you work so that you can have pride that you have a job and that you are able to work and earn your income. So rather than judging people, he was open to learning, and he held back his emotions and his judgment, and he started to be curious and ask other people. Research on curiosity shows us that when we're inquisitive, when we are open, we develop better cultural intelligence. We need to become comfortable with difference. Very, very important. Become comfortable with the fact that people are different, and we need to learn about each other. Forgive me for a second here. I am getting a little distracted. Somebody is saying that they can't hear, and I'm just trying to make sure that I'm doing the right thing. Finally, knowledge building. We need to learn about other people, people in our communities, people in our workplace, people in our synagogues, in our churches, in our mosques, in our temples. Very, very important to build knowledge, and not just sit on that knowledge, but do like my former student and colleague William did, try to hold back and develop skills, develop a repertoire of skills so that you can react or not react. You can be proactive and deal better with situations that come up, to be open, to be curious and seek out, why do people do this? And then build knowledge so that the more you learn, the more you can exhibit positive behaviors. And I like to use the metaphor of going backstage. We all love performances in one form or another. And when you think about it, if we are watching a performance, we're spectators, and we're taking in all the wonderful music or the dance or the acting or the sports game. But if we want to understand more about the sports team, or if we're going to an Italian opera or a Peking opera, and we start to read about the history of what's happening, or who are the singers and the musicians, and even if we get to go backstage, then we get to see what's happening. We learn more about the performance, and we can understand not just what is happening, but why. And I want to conclude on this. I think we're familiar with the iceberg metaphor. Behavior and symbols, the things that we love about cultural differences when we travel. What we eat, what other people here eat, listening to a language, listening to music, seeing a festival and what people might wear, how people behave. That's fascinating. But we know with the metaphor, the tip of the iceberg, most of what's below the iceberg um, is what we can't see. And attitudes, beliefs, values, those are really important. And that's the why of the what. We can see what's on top. We can see what's on stage. But we have to go below the surface or behind the curtain in order to understand um, somebody's principles for behavior, somebody's beliefs for what's right or wrong, or somebody's attitudes for what they think. And if we can do that, then we have a better chance of building our cultural intelligence. So if we go back to the opening scenario, Ms. Werner was well-intentioned. She was trying to use her openness, her curiosity, and her knowledge building. But she didn't have it quite right. She was looking at her interaction with Mr. Zhang on her terms. And so she used a communication strategy that she thought would be accepted. And she was direct, she was individual, she was informal in her interactions. And she thought that it was good to be egalitarian and to use his first name based upon her cultural norms. But Mr. Zhang had a different engagement strategy. In his strategy, you use family names and title. And you don't call somebody by their Chinese name. That's very personal. If he says to call him Charles, then you call him Charles. Remember, they're a collective group, and you don't want to let somebody into your group unless you really know them. And I'm trying to advance to my next slide, and there's no next slide. Thank you, Celia. So they were basically not on the same frame of reference. And they both thought that they knew what they were doing and what the other person needed and wanted. And so Miss Werner had this unconscious incompetence. And that's not a bad thing. She just didn't know that she was acting in the way that Mr. Zhang needed. And in return, Mr. Zhang had some hidden bias because he was backing off. He was suspicious of her. And his way of smiling basically meant that he was nervous, he was uncomfortable. And saying, yes, okay, of course, was a way that he was trying to use his conversational strategy to be polite. So they both were trying to be open and kind and considerate and curious and learn and trying to learn about each other. But they needed to learn and be open to learn more about the other person's communication strategies. Could this make or break a deal? Possibly. But could there be an opportunity in the future for them to reconnect and try to do some business? Possibly, yes. Every day for me here in China, I experience situations like this, and it's a learning curve. While I have lived in Asia, I lived in Hong Kong for a number of years, and I've been working in China for over 13 years, back and forth. Every day I'm learning something. And just because I might write books on intercultural communication and global leadership, just because I have these living experiences, just because I'm studying Chinese, doesn't mean that I'm always going to get it right. So finally, we have to not worry about offending people. We have to remember that culture is invisible. And we have to make sure that we think from the other person's viewpoint and be curious and ask them what some of what's shaped their values and beliefs and attitudes. We all have invisible norms, and we need to learn to play the rules of the games based upon somebody else's rules. So, in conclusion, cultural intelligence requires openness, curiosity, and building knowledge so that we can then try to develop a repertoire of actions. And I leave us with these 5 key takeaways, and we'll open this up to answering some of the questions that Celia, our coordinator, has been collecting. So Celia, how do I get those questions? Okay, we're going to have a lag here, and our coordinator is going to send the questions. And I want to thank Celia and Robert, our other media expert, for helping us with this webinar. Maybe while I am waiting, I can just in case people, when they listen to this, if they don't see the slide, they can hear the wrap-up. The 5 key takeaways are, we know that globalization means increased trade, tariffs, migration, technology. So even though the world's shrinking, gaps between our people and our governments occur. So just because the world's shrinking doesn't mean that we are not having miscommunication understanding. And as human beings, we're naturally monocultural in our thinking and behaving. We have to constantly think about being more multicultural. The third point is we can all develop CQ, or cultural intelligence. And being culturally intelligent means we can develop openness, curiosity, and knowledge building, or skills. And then we become culturally intelligent when we can see below the surface and develop skills to understand attitudes, beliefs, and values better. Okay, so thank you. I have one of the questions says, can we relate the story about Ms. Werner and Mr. Zhang to the 6th dimension? Absolutely. I can go back over some of that. Let's go back to the 6th dimension. Oops. Okay, so power distance. These 2 people were not yet colleagues, and they both want to do business with each other. So when you think about power distance is not going to come into play here because one is the other person's supervisor or superior or boss. It's all about the power distance from their respective countries or cultures. So Mr. Zhang has a very high power distance generally from the Chinese culture, and you are very formal with how you communicate with people. Ms. Werner has, being from the U.S. and being of German descent, has a lower power distance. It still has some high power distance, but it's not as much. So she's going to look very much egalitarian towards how she communicates with Mr. Zhang. When we look at the individualism, she can be very, very much call me by my first name. She's not thinking about the family values. She's thinking about herself. And she's thinking about, okay, great, we just met each other, let's do business. Okay? That's also related to long-term and short-term orientation. Um, she wants to be able to quickly make the introductions. I like you. I hope you like me. Let's do business. And with her individualism, she is going to just rely on the fact that in her culture, people do things based upon what they think is best for the situation. And if she had thought more in a collectivist viewpoint, she might like to try to hold back and ask him some questions rather than just jumping in and trying to steer the conversation. In terms of the achievement-oriented, this is also interrelated. She was being rather aggressive and wanting to immediately, let's look for success. Let's get to the main point. Let's have a meeting. Let's try to do business. And, excuse me, Mr. Zhang was trying to be a little more collaborative and a little bit more laid back. Uncertainty avoidance. One might say, wait a minute, isn't this a contradiction? If China tends to be low on uncertainty avoidance, then he should be more accepting of Ms. Werner's request for interacting and meeting so quickly and trying to establish this relationship. But we have to remember that in Chinese culture, you've got the high power distance, you've got the high collectivism, and you've got the high long-term orientation. So all of these different dimensions can come into play and have a certain outcome based upon their interaction. So I hope that that response was helpful. And I'm looking at the time, and I want to move on to some of the other questions. And Celia, I hope that maybe I can collect these questions and then respond to them from my perspective. And that way they could be posted so other people could look at them. I'm not sure if that's possible. Here's a good question. If cultural intelligence is invisible and making mistakes is okay, how can we make the other understand our openness and willingness to tune in? Cultural intelligence, I wouldn't look at it as being invisible. I would look at the culture, like the behaviors on top are visible and the underlying values, beliefs, and attitudes are invisible. I would say cultural intelligence is a lot of meta communication, that intrapersonal communication, thinking about things, learning about things. And then it's also the interpersonal communication. But I think the more that we learn about ourselves and we learn about others and we engage in the knowledge building, we can't make other people understand. We can't make other people be open or willing. But if we learn some of these strategies and techniques for asking questions, for being polite, for maybe holding back and saying in this situation, oh, it is so good to meet you, Mr. Zhang. May I call you Mr. Zhang? Or what should I call you? How would you like to proceed? If we can do a little bit of question asking and trying to see things from somebody else's viewpoint, we can become more successful. That's such a loaded question and so much good ideas in there that hopefully maybe I could write a little bit more about this. So here's a very interesting question, and maybe we can read more. Maybe I can read this quickly. Do I still have another minute, Celia? Or maybe I'll just quickly chat while I. Okay, I do have a couple more.
Yes, Elizabeth, you can continue, and if people have to leave, then we'll just have the answer on the recording.
Okay, should I go through every single question?
We were thinking that maybe since there are so many, that maybe we could just answer to them on the forum, or then share the answers as they come afterwards in an email, for example. But we'll inform everyone that's here today. In any case.
Shall I take?
If you want to answer maybe one more. Yeah.
Okay. There's some really great questions here. So great. I can respond to these on the forum. Okay. Can you advise a book to learn more about multicultural interaction? Absolutely. First, I'm going to encourage all of you to go to the Hofstede Insights website. And there is so much information on that website. And we have a number of books that we are publishing by different associates. They are awesome books. We have one that's recently, just last year, by Diego Giordano, has been published something on China. So if you're interested about China, we have two colleagues, Mark Jacobs and Jean-Pierre Cohn, just wrote something on negotiation. It's an awesome book. We have, I'm trying to think of some of the other titles. We have another book that's going to be coming out later this year or next year, talking about little scenarios just like this and explaining them via the cultural dimensions. And I'm one of the editors of that book, working on that. You can go to Amazon.com and order my book. I have a recent book out on intercultural communication for business, global business, how leaders can communicate with success. So many great books out there, and I'm going to encourage you first to go to the Hofstede Insights website and take a look, and then you can read through all of the different associates, and different people have written different books. But those would be great books, and I can write some more of those on the forum. I also invite you to join my LinkedIn blog. I'm doing a lot of blogging about cultural experiences as related to China. And you can start to find lots of good information on the website, our website, so that you can begin, or not begin, but to continue your learning. And I also have a couple of online courses that I do. A lot of us are involved in so many different types of in-company teaching and training, online courses that we've developed. So a lot of great resources out there, and we're just thrilled that you have joined this webinar today. So with that, I guess we will end to try to stay on time, and I am really glad that you wrote all these questions, and I promise I will respond and give you some answers, and I welcome you to contact me through the Hofstede website, and through, I think all of our emails can be connected. You can connect with us, and I'm happy to answer questions personally. You can also contact me through LinkedIn. So thank you, everybody, for attending. I know everyone's busy, and I hope that this can be just the beginning of more conversations.